Welcome back, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us back for this keynote discussion brought to you by Medidata. It is my pleasure to welcome Glen de Vries, who I am delighted to say is no stranger to HitLab. Glen is co-CEO and co-founder of Medidata, the most used platform for clinical trials around the world. Medidata has powered tens of thousands of clinical trials with millions of patients and billions, with millions of patients and billions of patient records. In 2019, in one of the largest healthcare technology acquisitions in history, Medidata became part of Dassault Systems. Glen has been driving Medidata's mission since the company's inception in 1999, powering smarter treatment in healthier people by advancing the digital transformation of life sciences. He received his undergraduate degree in molecular biology and genetics from Carnegie Mellon University, where he is now a trustee, worked as the research scientist at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, and studied computer science at NYU's Courant Institute of Mathematics. And some of you might know, Glen is the author of an important book published only a couple months ago, The Patient Equation, The Precision Medicine Revolution in the Age of COVID-19 and Beyond. It is my great pleasure to welcome Glen de Vries.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the lovely introduction. We'll start with that book, The Patient Equation. Just to be clear, if anybody buys the book, all proceeds go to Conquer Cancer, the ASCO Foundation. And the book has a lot of stories in it about the experience I've been so lucky to have had in life sciences and healthcare. But I want to tell you three what may sound like interrelated, but may not sound like interrelated stories, only one of which is in the book. So thanks for having me. Like I said, you'll get some additional material that's not in there. Because actually the story of the patient equation and what I want to talk about today, I think I can trace back to, I'm no stranger to HitLab, I'm no stranger to Columbia Presbyterian. It's where I did some of my first work after getting my undergraduate degree. And I was looking for patients in the hospital to enroll in a study that I was doing. And nobody had cell phones back then. We all just had pagers, and I got a page, and I went to go enroll a patient and get a blood sample from them. And this was a prostate cancer study. And this patient, I found out, and just chatting with them, was an engineer by training. And he, in his wallet, kept a little card, a little piece of graph paper. And it had a table on it, and it had dates and his PSA value, his prostate specific antigen value. And if you're a man over 40, you probably know what that is. Hopefully not from issues around your prostate, but it's how you keep an eye on it, and certainly a key biomarker that people look at for prostate health. And this gentleman is being treated for prostate cancer, and he had been tracking on this little piece of paper in his wallet his dates and PSA values. And I think it was the first time, as I said, it was kind of the first moment in certain things related to the book, that I ever saw a patient tracking their own biomarkers. Fast forward, actually about 20 years, maybe a little bit less. And this is something that you can read more about in the book if you're interested in it. I met a patient named Jack Whalen. Jack is sadly passed away now. He had a rare blood cancer, but was an incredibly articulate and powerful patient advocate. And to be slightly hyperbolic about it, I think Jack, I won't say saved his life because he did pass away, but extended his life significantly. And he did it with Microsoft Excel. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. Jack was a participant in many clinical trials and had his various therapeutic arcs since the moment he was diagnosed with this blood cancer. And in Microsoft Excel, he tracked his biomarkers, multiple ones, not just like the gentleman who had prostate cancer. And he would look at, this is what happened to his biomarkers, tracking his disease as he went through not just one clinical trial, but a particular clinical trial. And then maybe he responded and he was off that clinical trial and went on to another one when his cancer started to come back, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing that, by being an active participant in his own healthcare. Jack actually started to look for clinical trials that might benefit him, given his knowledge of what was happening in his body with his disease in a very engineering focused way, is the way he thought. But I literally think that this spreadsheet, of course, him populating it with data and reacting to that and looking at his health on a longer arc, preserved his life in a very significant way. Fast forward to a couple of weeks ago. I was on a call with a physician, only coincidentally related to prostate cancer. Yes, that's where I started my career. Yes, that's what this person I was speaking to a few weeks ago works on. But it was actually a continuation of this same concept. And a very forward-thinking oncologist, somebody who has a role in clinical trials, so some of his patients participate in clinical trials, but also as an academic researcher, somebody who also takes some patients and gives them off-label medications, so uses existing medications in ways that are not part of what the approved use is, but it's certainly completely acceptable way for a physician to treat a patient, and also uses medications that are completely approved and on the market for his patients who he thinks would benefit from a particular on-market therapy. Also, I think worth noting, particularly in prostate cancer, because it is sometimes a quite slow growing cancer, where unless it's highly invasive, it may be that the patient needs to think about heart disease more than they have to think about dying from prostate cancer. There were patients he had who were just in watchful waiting. Maybe it was because they were in remission, maybe because their cancer wasn't bad enough and aggressive enough yet to actively treat. But he was looking for, frankly, complaining about the fact that nothing existed, like Jack Whalen's spreadsheet. What could he use that could track the critical biomarkers, the disease progression for his patients as they, like Jack, went from not being treated after a diagnosis, or maybe immediately treated by something that's on market. Maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it stopped working. Maybe he tries an off-label medication. Maybe that worked, maybe that didn't. Maybe the patient goes into a clinical trial. Maybe the patient doesn't respond to that clinical trial and has to go into another clinical trial for another experimental medicine. And maybe he's not even the treating physician because he's not a participant from an investigator perspective in that clinical trial. Where is the thing in the life of this investigator, in the life of this physician who I was speaking to weeks ago, where is this thing that Jack did with technology, with Microsoft Excel as an individual? Where is this thing that, I don't know his name, the person who I met now literally a quarter century ago at Columbia Presbyterian, looking at being in this research study I was doing on a piece of paper? This is the origin of the patient equation concept. Before we think about the literal word of an equation, just think about the geometry of something for a second. You have this timeline, and a patient is diagnosed with a particular condition. And then regardless of what happens, regardless of how they're treated, there is a course of their life after that diagnosis. And it may have, as we talked about with Jack, and we talked about this other oncologist I was speaking with, different components of different therapeutic choices along that timeline. And I don't mean to be morose about it. This is just the mathematical reality of this timeline. It begins with diagnosis, and it ends either with, hopefully, a cure, or after, ideally, active management of this disease so it doesn't affect the person clinically, but death. And maybe it was death from that particular condition or from something else. But that is the timeline that we need to think about. Now, Jack was worried about his blood cancer, as obviously he should have been. The first patient was worried about their prostate cancer, as of course they should have been. The oncologist I was talking to is worried about the best possible combinations or sequences of therapies for all of his patients in terms of how to help them preserve and improve their quality of life. But there's another element that single timeline of diagnosis leading to death or cure doesn't actually encompass. And now I want you to take this single geometric line and start to think about it fanning out. And depending on how you think about math, just remember that if we're plotting something on a line, if we're plotting something in one dimension, whether we're plotting something in two dimensions, whether we're plotting something in n dimensions, there is an equation that will determine that arc of that line, the area that we're plotting, or at least be a best fit for data that we see there. And remember that line I was talking about. Well, now imagine it fanning out, because there's not just one condition that affects all of us. There's not just one potential disease that might impinge on our quality of life, or hopefully not, but ultimately, inevitably end it. We have to think about multiple dimensionality. The prostate cancer, heart disease, diabetes, a rare disease where we need some kind of enzyme replaced, whatever it is, all of these things are part of our life. And the patient equation, yes, the book, but just this idea of thinking more broadly and differently, mathematically, about us as individuals is how we can use that plot, that information, to make the best possible decisions. One of the great things about HitLab, and I know the audience that we have today, is we have people who are really concerned about healthcare and life sciences and technology, but also there are people who are thinking about the business of that, and whether it's big companies or entrepreneurs just getting started up. And I wish I could tell you who originally said this to me, where the credit might come from. But I remember hearing along the way, as I was an entrepreneur, that a company can be defined by the summation of the decisions that all of its employees made. I learned a really important lesson that day, just as an aside, which is if you're thinking about bringing people into your team, you should really feel confident in their ability to make decisions, because whether it's the important decision that you as a leader are making, or maybe what seems like an unimportant decision or a small scope decision, the summation of all of that over time, and you, if you're successful, are going to have more employees than you have yourself. The summation of all that is going to be the state of a company in any given moment. I think it's a cool idea. I bring it up because I think it's an idea related to biology, and it's an idea that is embodied in this idea of the patient equation. Again, you heard I'm no stranger to HitLab. I'm no stranger to Columbia. I think one of the first HitLab lectures I ever had the pleasure of giving was up at the public health school, or HitLab related. Stan hooked it up for me. Was up at public health school on the campus where I did my research, where I met that prostate cancer patient so long ago. And I put up a picture during the lecture of information about you from a health perspective. And I always caveat this by saying, I know what I'm saying about your genes is a little bit untrue. There are many times when mutations happen in cancers, the immune system, but basically the genes that you're born with, remember the timeline I was talking about? Those genes are largely, in most of the cells in your body, the same as what you're born with, your germline DNA sequence. But the phenotype, how those genes are on or off, how long they're on or off, how quickly the messenger RNA for the biologists gets degraded, how much of it is turned into proteins, how those proteins interact and are assembled into organelles, systems, cells, organs, our totality of being. Unlike our genes, the number of things that happens in that, think about the decisions of those employees, the number of contributors to your current health state, that actually goes up very quickly, goes up really from the moment of conception. And the environment plays a role in it, as do, like the decisions of employees, the choices that we make and that are made for us from a healthcare perspective. Do we go to a physician who puts us on an existing therapy or an experimental therapy? Is it a diagnosis that requires immediate treatment, or is there some period of time where we decide to do some watchful waiting and see what happens? Did you have the fatty hamburger or did you have the salad? Did you do the exercise or not? All of these things are the decisions that are made for us where we are, or made with us, perhaps by a physician, by our family, or we make, that contribute to, based on the initial conditions, right? That genetic code and whatever was sitting in us at the moment of conception from a cellular perspective, but contribute to a lot more information. And the patient equation, quite literally now, is the idea of taking the totality of that information. Impossible to take it all. Nobody's information is going to be the same. There's so many decisions that it's just a vast array of data. And I don't care how cool you are from a machine learning and AI perspective, there's going to be mathematically, by certainty, a law of diminishing returns on what would happen if you analyzed every piece of it. But what are the key contributors, the key factors in the equation that help us decide for us right now, what is the best possible therapeutic course for us to take? What diseases do we need to worry about or not worry about? What preventative measures will be the things that will create the most sustainability in our good health, in our high quality of life? And if we measure everything, we should be able to figure that out. Now, decisions in business, if I go back to that metaphor, a lot of them are pretty easy. There's some pretty quantitative, objective things. Top line growth, your profitability. There are things that are a little bit, to be fair, less objective. There's subjectivity in regards to your employees' level of satisfaction and engagement, your clients' level of satisfaction. There, people try to measure those things with scales, but it's not like looking at your cholesterol. That said, most of those subjective things, at least in the world of business, will lead up to a pretty objective outcome in terms of the health of a company. It may not be quite as simple in individuals and their health, although I'll at least give you one thought in terms of how that changes or is changing today. But we think about our health in terms of some things that are very concrete, you know, our blood chemistry, our cholesterol level, the number of white blood cells that are detectable in a blood sample from us. You go from the genetic mutations that have occurred in a given cell in a cancer, but you go from kind of this low level, I don't mean low, unimportant, I mean small, physically small, things like gene sequences and molecules, and it goes all the way up and up, and we're very good at measuring things objectively and quantitatively when we think about blood chemistry, assessing the mass of a tumor, things that we can do with medical imaging. We get a little bit worse when we start to think about things like neurodegeneration and what is the cognitive changes that are happening in us? What are the behavioral changes? Am I enjoying life as much as I did a couple days ago? Well, I mean, I can fill out a survey and tell you, but we know that that's going to come with certain biases. I certainly can't compare my survey trivially with the survey of one other individual, maybe a population given some other similar initial conditions. But for anybody who's done research in things related to depression, as an example, you know that you can't necessarily take the scale as responded to by one population of patients and trivially compare it to other patients. But we're beginning to be able to climb that cognitive and behavioral ladder and not necessarily have to rely only on the self-reported feelings of a patient. And this is where actually I think these patient equations are going to become so much richer in the next 5-10 years than they are today. And it's because we're starting to put quantitative, objective data around some of that cognition and behavior, and that comes from the world of sensors, as well as our connectivity to the rest of the digital world. The same way a pedometer can tell you whether or not I've been out walking around, and I bet those of us, I'm here in downtown New York where I live, I bet most of our pedometers in COVID-19 have gone down. But there's also been changes in our thinking, in our digital connectivity that are related to our cognition. And again, I'm not suggesting that we measure it in any kind of Big Brother style way, although maybe there are things that we can do in an observational way that will be added to these equations. But we are interacting with each other over Zoom. We're interacting with people over social media. There's the amount of times that we text people, or we check our calendar, or the language that we're using, verbally or digitally. All of these things, I think, are going to begin to give us the ability to climb that whole ladder and start to add more objective quantitative measures, so that we have a much better field, if I use the term I did before, to find the things that matter, to go into the equations that help us make the best possible decisions in healthcare. Why is, I hope, this an interesting, important topic? Because it doesn't matter if you're inventing a new tool for healthcare, a new drug, a new medical device, a new app. If you are somebody who is going to help patients choose that therapy, or choose not to use it, or come up with a combination of therapies, because you're a nurse, you're a physician, you're a researcher, or you are one of us, one of the people who are going to make a decision. And again, if you believe me, and I hope you do on this one, you're making decisions that affect your health, full stop. Whether or not whether or not you're as thoughtful about it as Jack Whalen was or not. What are the things that we need to measure, both from an input and an output perspective, to make those great decisions? That is the patient equation. And that is something that everybody involved in the world of health and healthcare, us included, as I just said, is a key stakeholder. And it's where so much, I think, innovation will come. Not just in the next 5-10 years, but I really think it's going to define the next era. Maybe it's 50 years of what happens in healthcare. The molecular biology revolution that I think you can say is 50 years old in terms of being kind of mainstream, that defined a lot that we're doing now. I think this idea of thinking differently mathematically will really be part of the next 50 years. Normally, I like to talk about populations and go down to individuals. But today I decided to think about this a little bit differently. And I just talked to you about some individual cases and how we think about the health of one person. I want to talk about population health for a second. And 2020 has been a weird year. I can't imagine it wasn't a weird year for a lot of people. And not necessarily weird entirely in a bad way. There's definitely been some terrible things that have happened this year. We have a pandemic. We have people whose murders were passed around the world on video. In the case of the latter, I think a lot of people woke up, for lack of a better term, to some serious issues that have been sitting there for a long time around social justice or injustice. Well, COVID-19, the pandemic, is in of itself its own problem, big problem that needs to be obviously be dealt with. But I think it also is something that should be, and certainly for some of us is, showing us that we needed a wake-up call in terms of issues that we have in health care as well. And these are really issues that I think we should talk about from a population perspective. In COVID-19, if you don't want to, or can't go to an academic medical center to continue your cancer therapy, that's been a problem for a lot of people. If you, in COVID-19, decided not to or couldn't go to because they were closed, your physician to actively manage a chronic condition, one of those things on the timeline that hopefully ends in cure, but maybe it's a long timeline, or maybe it's a chronic condition you're going to deal with till you die. If you weren't actively managing that because of COVID-19, your condition is probably getting worse, or at least certainly not getting better. That's a problem. If you are an otherwise healthy individual, you think you're healthy, and you didn't go for your checkup, you didn't get your bloods done, whatever it was, because of the pandemic, maybe there's something that it should have been the first point in one of those arcs in your health that you missed. And now you can't make certain decisions that you should be making. Well, in any of those three cases, you are a proxy. And I'm also guessing that we have lucky for us, but we need to wake up and think about the people who aren't in this situation. We have people who are connected to the world of healthcare and probably have access to an academic medical center, like not just metaphorically, literally, and are being proactive about our healthcare. But the pandemic has shown us that that's not what happens in all of the world. There are issues around inequity in care, and they've been around a long time. In fact, it's been one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals since, I don't know when they started them, a while. It's number 3 on their list is healthcare for all, everywhere. And there was an article that I keep going to, I can't get it out of my head, that was in Nature Medicine a couple months ago, and it's maps of the world. And it shows you how far people are, whether they're taking an automated means of transport, like a car or a train, or have to walk. There is a lot of Earth. There is a lot of the United States. There is a lot of Europe. No, not where I'm sitting in the East Coast and not Central Europe, but where people are far from care. And when we think about those decisions, when we think about the tools, the things that we're going to use, the things that our physicians are going to prescribe us, the opportunities that we as members of the human population of Earth have, I think we need to solve this problem of access. And by the way, if we had it solved, we wouldn't have had the issues that we have for everybody in every situation. Maybe it won't be all that we'll solve, but we'd have fewer in something like a global pandemic, because you can't get something diagnosed, you can't get something actively managed, you can't get something treated that desperately needs that treatment. And so I actually think that patient equations and this idea of thinking about these decisions and these tools that I think so many people participating in this conference will help invent and provide, we need to do it in a way that addresses this issue of access and equity. And by the way, as an aside, you know, I talked about business before. Not only is that the right thing to do ethically and what we all signed up for being in life sciences, but by the way, that's an economic opportunity. You know, I am in no way suggesting that this should be done in any kind of exploitative way. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at that Nature Medicine article and you look at everywhere that the Earth is dark, if you create a therapy that only works when you have an academic medical center as a place to go get it, those are all the people that you actually couldn't sell it to at whatever price it turns out to be. So if we start to think differently about the inputs, about the outputs, and then in the patient equation, about the ability to make those decisions in the middle, we will set ourselves up for a post-pandemic world that, as unfortunate as the situation is, both inclusive of infectious disease and this kind of threat to global health, but also to what impacts us as individuals, as patients, is a much better world to live in. So I hope that's a call to action to everyone. It certainly is to me. Thank you so much for your time. It was great to be here, and back to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you so much for your insights. That was an incredible presentation. Really great to hear from you, Glenn. For everyone listening, I want to once again remind you the title of Glenn's book is The Patient Equation, The Precision Medicine Revolution in the Age of COVID-19 and Beyond. I encourage you all to pick it up. And if you aren't going to, then you better engage in all of our different networking opportunities, because Medidata, as a prize sponsor, has offered 25 autographed copies of his newest book to the highest engaging attendees. So get to work. Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care. All right. Thank you again. Thank you to everybody. And thank you, big thank you to Glenn for his presentation. Up next, we're going to be taking another